big nerd, big 80s arcade nerd, huge. I was talking to a guy the other day in Springfield, Missouri, and he grew up there, and I was talking to him about how my dad, when he was working on business trips and he was working in the Springfield area, he would drop me at the mall, and I would go to Aladdin's castle, and he would give me like $5, and 10 minutes later, I would be like, now what do I do? But Aladdin's Castle was like this really cool arcade. I loved arcades. I love arcade games. Any 80s in here, folks, like arcade games? You like the old 8-bits? Yeah. I notice a few of you are just doing this. You nervous about it? Come on, Galaga, Pac-Man, come on. Yeah. So those were real games, and I'll talk about that today. I'm going to talk about several different things with video game technology, and I thought I wanted to be a video game programmer back when I was a young man, and I tried to learn on my own. I did learn BASIC. I started COBOL, which are programming languages, and then I went to college and realized it was way more math than I wanted to do, and they were talking about spreadsheet programming and stuff, and I was like, boring. So I went into something much more interesting. That was philosophy and religion. I don't know. But anyway, we're going to talk about leveling up, because that is a consistent theme in video games, leveling up, getting to the next level. And that's one thing that has remained constant. And I'm going to talk about a lot of the changes in video games that I've witnessed over my lifetime. But the one thing that's pretty consistent is this idea of leveling up, of kind of getting better at the game, fighting harder enemies, fighting harder challenges. Maybe it's a puzzle game even, and it gets more difficult as you go. And that kind of fuels something in us. We like that challenge to keep us moving forward. One unfortunate thing in our spiritual health and our spiritual life is that we can get stagnant pretty easy. And there's not always a push to level up. And so a couple times a year, I try to take a Sunday out and say, let's talk about this. I talk about it in lots of different ways. How we grow was our one in the winter months that I did last year, where I talked about in the spring and winter, how do we grow? And we did a 3-week look at that. Today is just a one-day thing, but I want to give you some options today that we've come up with. And in the past at Coffee Creek, we kind of had this idea that everybody would do one thing. And that never worked very well, because everybody has different calendars. Some of you feel just maxed out, that you don't have any room to breathe. Work, kids, sports schedules, and you're just like, please don't put one more thing on my calendar. Please don't ask me for one more thing. And it makes you kind of feel like a failure when you can't do the one thing that we ask you to do, right? And so knowing that, and knowing that sports is kicking off, and football, North, right? You guys had a good victory, North football. Yeah, where's the North fan? No North fans? Okay, that's fine. Just kidding. I know you're here. Deer Creek fans. Deer Creek had a victory. Couple. Oklahoma State victory. Took a little overtime to get there. That's all right. OU victory. Yeah, it's a victory. It's a win. It's a win. It's a win. It's all good. So yeah, that whole season gets started, right? 8 hours of television yesterday watching football. And then, we get busier and busier and busier. But some of you have open schedules now, like you're empty nesters now, or maybe things are opening up, or you've been empty nesters for a long time, and you got that, or you don't have kids, or you don't have a lot going on at work in this certain season, but next season's going to be. So we're just all at different places. So I'm going to give you lots of different options today. I believe that one of these ideas will fit any schedule possible. And I'm going to say to you, just choose one. If that's all you've got time for, choose one. If you got more time, maybe choose two. But don't overburden yourself. Pick a couple and go strong at it, and work and think about this leveling up concept. Now, our 3 priorities at Coffee Creek, which we have established in 2013, are pretty simple. We want to equip the next generation, we want to strengthen marriages, and we want to build community. We said, what can we really do with our size? At that point, we were much smaller. What can we accomplish? And if we did these 3 things, we would look back and go, okay, wow, we've done this. Now, this is outside of our overall purpose, right? Our overall purpose is to make Jesus known to our community, right? But we said, what are like 3 connected strategies of targets we want to hit? And this was 3 things we talked about: equip the next generation of Christ followers, strengthen marriages, and build a community of Christ followers. That was kind of our concept. And so we just talked about, in the last series, we talked about what it means to equip the next generation. So today, we're going to focus solely on this third part of building community. What does that look like? Our vision from the beginning has been in an area that is ever expanding and growing, that feels very large and feels very anonymous, to make that feel more like home, a community where people know you, where life is done together with others, where Bible reading and prayer are spiritual disciplines that are executed together in community, because we know if we ignore those, it is often to our detriment. How can we change our community for good? What can we really accomplish with the time that we have here? So today I want to illustrate that no matter where you're at, no matter what level you're at right now in your spiritual health, there's always a next step. There's always that level you can be working for to grow closer to being like Jesus. And that is what discipleship is all about. That word, when you hear discipleship, it is about becoming more like Jesus a little bit tomorrow or next week than you were the previous week or the previous day. And that over your lifespan, you ought to be able to look back at periods of growth, and there will be periods of stagnation. Well, our goal is to help you to not lapse into those valleys where you bottom out or you high center, but instead to continue moving forward and looking forward towards more spiritual health, higher spiritual growth. And I want to illustrate this with this concept of video games. So let's talk about how, and I want to break it down even smaller. I'm not talking about the next 5 or 10 years of your life. I'm talking about between now and Christmas. How can you move up one level? One level in your spiritual health, one level in your spiritual growth between now and Christmas. It's a short time frame. It helps us to focus, helps us to say, is this doable? Helps us to look at what is right in front of us. And I want to do that by talking about, I mentioned I'm a nerd, a video game nerd, and that I studied video games, not just to play them, but how they are built. And I like to take things apart and think about things. And so I studied video game structure and what the thinking is behind those when they make those games. And so for the longest time, there was pretty much one video game structure, and that is a linear structure. Basically, the game had a beginning point, and then you had little things happening along the way, but you had to kind of go straight through them. And so like Mario, pretty much you're going straight through to the princess, and you're rescuing her, and she's not in this castle, and keep going. And so you keep moving forward. Leveling up is merely going to a new world or level on the screen, but pretty much there's not a lot that can happen. You can't go from Italian plumber Mario to becoming Bowser at the end of the game or something like that, right? There's no real journey for your character. It is pretty much beginning to end, and your choices don't really change a whole lot other than you get to move on and keep moving forward. So that was the first kind of pretty simple video game structure. And then a new version came out, and a lot of people call this the lake structure or the string of pearls structure of video games. And that is where your choices start to deviate out a little bit, and you can follow it down into side quests. And so like the Lego series of video games kind of shows this. You don't have to do all the extra things, but if you want to go down this path and do these things, you can. But at the end, everybody still gets the same ending of the game. So you're still in a linear path beginning to end, but you have kind of detours. And those detours are optional, but if you choose to do those, you'll get a different experience than everyone else. And the final one is kind of the most modern, and a lot of role-playing games kind of incorporate this into them, but this is the branching model. And the branching model says, yes, these side quests will take you off, but if you go a certain direction, you'll get a completely different ending than someone else. You could choose to become kind of an evil person, or you could choose to become a good person, and your ending will reflect that. So when you get to the end of the game, there might be characters that aren't even there in one timeline. And so this is kind of like that multiverse kind of thinking at that point. Different people have completely different experiences with the game because they make different choices. And you can replay the game and get a whole different ending. And this is interesting to me because at this point, what I start to think about is the choices I make in this life and how I choose to do those does structure who I become. So even if we just shorten the timeline, and I'm not talking like at the end of your life, what's going to be written on your tombstone kind of stuff. I'm saying between now and January 1, right? Between now and Christmas, between now and December, there are choices you'll make that will either push you closer to becoming more like Jesus, or the default is stagnation and just you're the same, or even reverse and kind of deny your creation and become less like Jesus. Like, those are choices put before us right now. And it's not one big choice you'll make that'll do that, but it's everyday choices. And so how do you encourage yourself? How do you move forward? How do you have that accountability to not be stuck, but to make the little daily choices that add up to a big branch that you want to follow? In the book of Hebrews, we see this instruction: let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. In the early church, obviously there was already a need for encouragement, and it was rough times because the Christians were heavily persecuted. Nobody really wanted them around. The government didn't want them around. The religious folks in power didn't want them around. They were talking against government because they said Jesus is king. And Caesar had a real problem with that because Caesar was king. You can have your fake little religions, but you belong to the government of Rome, is kind of the perspective. And most other religions capitulated to that. They just were like, whatever, okay, Rome. And they kind of were allowed to do their own thing. The Christians were different. They were like, one king, King Jesus. Sorry, we're not following your rules. We're not playing your game. And so the Roman government had a big problem with that. And then they also said, well, Jesus is the King of the Jews. Jesus is God's son. And so you've got a whole nother problem there with all the religious leaders. And they're really upset about these Christians coming out and saying this. So you've made everybody mad. And they had to come together and protect each other and pray for each other and meet the needs. And so they needed to come together to encourage one another to not give up. Our challenges are not the same, but our challenges are just as serious in this day and age, in this culture, in this world. It is very easy to capitulate to culture. It is very easy to give up. It is very easy to be pulled around by our passions instead of focused on who God says we are, his creation, his children. That we are not citizens of this earth, but we are citizens of the kingdom of God. That there is one king, King Jesus. And while it's very easy to be confused in that, we could learn a lot from the Hebrews. We could learn a lot from that church that needed to learn that we must think, focus, dwell on ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. To not neglect this meeting together that is so important that sometimes it gets relegated to the last priority. Or when you're putting that calendar together, you're like, I just don't think I can make it fit. I can't make it fit. I got to breathe. I need more room. And it's like, no, don't give up that, because that's where you come for encouragement, to learn, to grow. And spiritual growth is important because it's tied to our mental health. It's tied to our physical health. It's tied to our relationship with our divine creator. And when that gets wonky or out of whack, everything else gets out of whack. It's easy to ignore, though, isn't it? Because if I don't eat food, I feel hungry and weak, and so I run and I get something, right? I get a snack, and I'm good. But when the spiritual side effects happen, what do? Well, what I should do is dive back into those things that grow me spiritually, reading the Bible, prayer, not forsaking the gathering. But I don't. Most of the time, when those spiritual hunger symptoms come up, we try to put something else in there. And really what it's trying to do is a Band-Aid to a very, very deep problem. So we'll try to read a book. We'll try to listen to a podcast. We'll try to watch something online. We'll try to ask advice from a friend. Job learned that Doesn't work very well in the Old Testament. Ask your friends, you're going to get bad advice. So here's where we're at now. What do we do when we have that spiritual hunger? Instead of returning to the source, Jesus tells the church in the book of Revelation, you've left your first love, right? You've gone away. Instead of returning to where we know the source of healing is in Jesus, so many times we try to do one big event, one big thing. If I go to this big Christian rock concert, man, that's going to set the whole year. And that's just not how it works. I love what this author said, Eddie said, spiritual growth is not the result of a dramatic experience, but it's a lot of small steps. You cannot be changed by one experience into spiritual maturity any more than you can become a full-grown adult by eating one meal. Think of spending time with God as one meal in the whole plan of your spiritual nutrition. And so what I am encouraging you today to do is to think about your spiritual meal plan just like you would think about your physical meal plan. Think about a variety of choices, healthy choices that will help grow you spiritually. Don't think about eating once a month or once a week even. You would never do that to your physical health. Well, I hope no one's doing that. That's not good for you, right? Instead, think about wise choices that will fuel you spiritually that you need every single day. You don't need every part of it every single day, but you need something every single day to deliver slowly this spiritual growth and health in your life. It takes time. Just like in a video game, leveling up is worth it. Leveling up in our spiritual way is worth it as well. I was trying to think of the greatest technological advancement in my life, and I could have talked about like space travel, and I realized I could have talked about, airplanes are a huge thing in humanity, the various medical treatments, but I think really at the end of the day, the greatest technological advancement of my life is the continue option in video games. Because if you grew up in the 80s and you were playing those very frustrating video games, you just got game over. I remember screaming and yelling and being out of money. And I'm like, what is this? Like, you couldn't put a quarter in and keep going. It was just, ha, 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 start over. And you're just upset, And so then the first game, now this is not, I looked up the lore on this. This is not the first game to have it, but it's the first game I remember having it at the arcade was Final Fight. And that was, he's got dynamite strapped to him, and he's trying to blow it out. And if you put the quarter in, he succeeds and blows it out, and you get to continue from where you were. Yeah. And so it's a great way to make more money, right? Frustrated kids stop being as frustrated anymore, and they're like, yeah, I can just put more money in and keep going. Before that, it was incredibly frustrating because you just started over. I remember getting halfway through a game one time, loved this game, and I died on the third life, and it was just like, yeah, back to the beginning, friend. That's maddening. And so now I love it because I have slowly been building up these home arcades at my home. And I have one that plays different kinds of games from the 80s. And so I've been going back through and beating those games. And like there's games I never saw past the first level, right, at the arcade. But now I've got a button I can push on the machine and it rewinds. So I fall off a cliff, rewind, whoop, there you go. It's the greatest thing ever. I've beat so many games. I'm just like, yeah, it's free now. And so it's amazing. I've been whooping up on all these games that I could never do. I mean, that's the thing. I like video games, and I always have, but I was never good at them. Like, I was not invited to any tournaments or anything like that. I was not that NES kid. I was terrible. I never beat Mario. Let me just put that out there. Confession time. We're going to have revival now, right? No, it's like... It's just like I got bored and busy and tired sometimes, and you get bored of a game when you just keep losing at it. And so maybe in your spiritual life, you're just like, you're bored or you're burned out, and you're like, well, I tried this before, and he's going to give me the same old ideas that I should be reading my Bible and I should be praying and I should meet with others. And maybe you're like, yeah, but that went wrong that time and that went bad that time. And I'm going to say to you, maybe it's time to try again. You don't give up. You just think maybe there's a different strategy. Maybe there's a different pattern that works better for me individually. You are an individual. And so maybe in your spiritual growth, where you're at in this next season of life, you just need to think about that next thing. But it may take a little grit. It may take a little determination on your part. Spiritual growth that comes easy is not likely to be lasting, real spiritual growth. If you want real spiritual growth, it is likely going to take some blood, sweat, or tears from you. It's likely going to take you involving yourself in the spiritual growth. One of my favorite authors said it this way. He said, Jesus tells us to set our hearts on the kingdom. Setting our hearts on something involves not only serious aspirations, like I really want this, but also strong determination. We must be determined, not just hopeful. He continues, a spiritual life requires human effort. The forces that keep pulling us back into a worry-filled life are far from easy to overcome. Friend, I would offer to you that most of us are stuck in that worry-filled life. And that is the life that is not fully trusting the outcomes to Jesus. We're still trying to figure out every outcome. We're still trying to correct it. We're still trying to grab the Ark of the Covenant. We're still trying to tell God how it really should be. We're still trying to figure it all out in our own strength. That's not the life Jesus has intended for us. That's not what he wants for you. Instead, he wants you to be able to trust him. How do we do that on our own? Well, I would offer to you that it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to do that. In the Proverbs, we find the author there saying, look, as iron sharpens iron, so a friend sharpens a friend. We find this idea that accountability is powerful, that teammates are useful. I remember when I was playing video games with my children, they were younger. My oldest and I were playing a video game, and he was terrible at it, and he's spinning in circles, and I'm thinking, this is not the kind of teammate I want. And then just a few years later, he was way better than me at that video game, and I was like, I am now the teammate he does not want. We need help. We need people to help us to see it through. In spiritual community and accountability helps us to stay on track. In the New Testament, Paul writes to the Galatian church, share each other's burdens, and in this way, obey the law of Christ. When we share what's going on in our life together, we find help. If you're stuck in difficult times, if you are at a place that you just can't move through, if you're like, next level, I can't make it through today, you need encouragement, and that can make all the difference. The last scripture in this vein, in the book of Ecclesiastes, the preacher writes, 2 people are better off than one. They can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. You have Old Testament, you have New Testament, you have the Hebrew wisdom literature, you have the Apostle Paul. They're all saying the same thing from different angles and different time periods. You need others. I remember one of the most exciting things for me, exciting and detrimental at the same time, as a kid, was when I would look at a video game and it would say 2-player, because I was an only child, and I knew that my mom and dad were not going to enjoy the game I was looking at. And I was like, how am I going to beat this game? And I would play some of these 2-player games and try to win, and it was terrible. And so luckily I had a cousin that would come and he would help me out, and we would be teammates, because it was very difficult to ever win some of those games by yourself. But if you had a second player, you had a person that would help you out, help you when you got hung up, help you through those levels, man, it would change everything. It reminds me that my spiritual life is not a solo mission. Spiritual growth is not a solo mission. It's a multiplayer adventure. In the Bible, one of my most favorite things to read is the one another passages. And I've read some scholars say there's 50 or 55. Another guy says he thinks there's like 100. They're not in the exact formation, but he thinks they're similar enough to be called that. But the one another's of the Bible. Think about what you see in the New Testament. Love one another, care for one another, encourage one another, pray for one another, fellowship with one another, live in harmony with one another, serve one another, accept one another, build one another up, teach one another, comfort one another, show hospitality to one another, forgive one another, and like 30 more. It's so awesome. This concept that we were given as a part of our core identity to Christianity is that we are in this together.